The wind howled through the barren trees, carrying with it the whispers of the past as the small group of paranormal investigators approached the crumbling gates of the Abandoned Villa Psychiatric Hospital on Long Island. Its looming structure was shrouded in darkness, its windows shattered and boarded up, and the once grand building now stood like a decaying monument to the suffering it had housed. It was one of the most cursed sites in the United States. Its reputation spread far and wide among paranormal seekers who had dared to enter and never returned, or at least, never returned unchanged. The hospital had been shut down decades ago, its tragic history buried beneath layers of neglect and rumors of cruel experimentation on patients. Staff had vanished mysteriously, some said to have been driven mad by what they had witnessed within those walls. Others claimed that the spirits of former patients, their tortured souls still lingering, would never leave. And the whispers of those who had entered the hospital, only to hear stories of unnatural phenomena, disturbing apparitions, objects moving on their own. Chilling whispers fueled the belief that the place was cursed beyond salvation. As the team set up their equipment in the overgrown parking lot, they couldn't shake the feeling that the air was thick with something that wasn't quite right. There was a palpable tension in the atmosphere, as though the building itself were alive, waiting. They made their way inside, passing through the rusted, creaking doors, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The hospital's once grand foyer now lay in ruins, the walls peeling and the remnants of broken furniture scattered across the floor. A chilling silence enveloped them, broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. They began to explore the lower levels, the oppressive atmosphere growing heavier with every step. In the dim light, they stumbled upon an old patient room, its door hanging loosely on its hinges. The room was in disarray, torn sheets on a battered bed, rusted medical equipment strewn across the floor, and a strange, dark stain that covered the floor in one corner. One of the investigators, Sarah, felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. This room, something happened here, she whispered, her voice trembling. They set up their cameras and EVP, electronic voice phenomena, equipment, hoping to capture any signs of paranormal activity. For a long time, nothing but the unsettling silence greeted them. But then, the air grew colder, a faint whisper drifting through the room. It was too soft to make out, but they all heard it, a voice, barely a breath, murmuring from the darkness. "Help me." The investigators froze. The whisper had come from no one in the room. It was the voice of a patient, a lost soul, lingering in the forsaken place. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hallway, followed by a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. The group jumped in fright, turning to look in the direction of the noise. A shadow passed quickly across the far wall, too large to be cast by any of them. The temperature dropped dramatically, their breath becoming visible in the air. One of the investigators, Jack, went to investigate the source of the noise, his flashlight cutting through the blackness. As he rounded a corner, he froze. At the end of the hallway, standing motionless in the shadows, was a figure, pale, gaunt, and dressed in the old, tattered hospital gown of a patient. Its face was obscured by shadow, but the hollow, vacant eyes could still be seen. Jack's blood ran cold. The figure didn't move, but the air around it was thick with a suffocating presence. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat, his body paralyzed with fear. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying him, before it slowly began to move toward him, dragging its feet with an agonizingly slow pace. "Jack! Get out of there!" Sarah shouted, rushing toward him. But as they tried to back away, the hallway stretched unnaturally long, the distance between them and the exit seemingly endless. The figure reached out with a thin, skeletal hand, its fingers clawing at the air as though trying to grasp something. The air turned frigid, and Jack screamed as the cold, dead hand brushed against his arm. Suddenly, the building seemed to come alive with noise, the sound of doors slamming shut, metal scraping against metal, distant screams echoing from deep within the hospital's walls. The lights flickered violently, and for a split second, they all saw it, dozens of ghostly faces pressed against the glass of the broken windows, eyes wide in terror, mouths open in silent screams. The investigators stumbled back, frantic to escape, but the hospital had other plans. The exit doors slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. The ghostly figure of the patient that had been following them now stood at the end of the hallway, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. Behind it, shadows began to form more figures, the tortured souls of patients and staff alike, all reaching out with twisted hands. Desperate, they rushed toward the stairs leading to the basement, hoping to find another way out. But the basement was even worse. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and blood-stained chains hung from the ceiling. The air was thick with a rancid stench, and as they entered, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them in total darkness. That's when they heard it, the faint sound of whispering, rising in volume. The walls seemed to pulse, as though the hospital was alive, feeding off their fear. The whispers grew louder, and then, a loud crash, the sound of something large falling to the ground. A low growl emanated from the darkness, and a cold wind swept through the basement, extinguishing their flashlights. As they fumbled for their equipment, the growl grew louder, more threatening. Suddenly, they heard a voice deep, guttural, and filled with hatred. "You shouldn't have come here." The investigators turned, only to see the figure of the doctor who had once run the hospital, standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes wide with madness, his lab coat stained with blood. In his hands, he held a syringe filled with a strange, dark substance. With a scream, the investigators ran for their lives, bursting through the basement door and into the night. They didn't look back until they were far from the cursed building. As they made their way to safety, one of them looked back over their shoulder at the decaying structure. Through the broken windows, they could see the faintest glow eyes, staring back at them from the darkness, waiting for the next group of trespassers to come. And in that moment, they knew that the spirits of the Abandoned Villa Psychiatric Hospital would never rest. The hospital had claimed its victims, and it would continue to do so, drawing in those who dared to uncover its secrets. The souls trapped within its walls would never let go, and neither would the hospital's dark past. The whispers would never stop. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The investigators had barely made it to their car, shaking, hearts pounding, and breaths short. But as they tried to collect themselves, a strange feeling washed over them. Something was wrong. They hadn't fully escaped. The unsettling feeling of being followed lingered, heavy and oppressive. It wasn't just the hospital they had left behind. It felt as if something was still tethered to them, waiting for the right moment to strike. As they sat in the car, Sarah glanced nervously out the rearview mirror. The hospital's silhouette loomed in the distance, the faint glow from its shattered windows still visible against the dark sky. For a brief second, she swore she saw figures moving behind the glass shadows, shifting in a way that couldn't be explained by the wind or the night. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice quivering. Before anyone could answer, a loud thud echoed from the trunk of their car. It was the sound of something heavy hitting the metal, followed by a low scraping noise as if something was trying to climb its way out from inside. The group froze, eyes wide with fear. They had just gotten away, but now it felt like the hospital was reaching out from the very ground they had just fled. "Should we look?" Jack's voice trembled, but before anyone could speak, Sarah got out of the car with a trembling hand, the others hesitantly following. They approached the trunk, their hearts racing in anticipation. Every nerve in their bodies screamed at them to run, but curiosity and fear bound them in place. Slowly, Sarah lifted the trunk latch. The darkness inside felt oppressive, as if the air had thickened with something evil, something alive. The moment the trunk opened, a cold, rancid wind burst out, smelling of old decay and death. And then, the unthinkable happened. A figure, a pale, gaunt woman in a torn hospital gown, sprang out from the darkness inside the trunk. Her face was twisted in agony, her eyes wide with terror, as if she had been trapped in the trunk for eternity. Her hands, claw-like and trembling, reached out for Sarah, her mouth opening in a silent scream. The group backed away in horror, but the woman continued to crawl out, her movements jerky and unnatural. The sound of her nails scraping across the metal of the car was deafening. Her body twisted unnaturally, as though she were both alive and dead at the same time. Suddenly, a burst of static erupted from their EVP recorder, which had been left running in the car. The device crackled with a distorted voice that seemed to come from all around them, not from the speaker, but from deep within the earth itself. "You cannot leave. You will never leave." The woman in the gown let out a bone-chilling laugh, a laugh that echoed with centuries of torment. It wasn't a human laugh, but something deeper, more sinister. It sounded like the remnants of a soul broken by pain and suffering, unable to escape the horrors of its past. Jack, who had been frozen in place, snapped into action. "Get in the car. Now!" he shouted, his voice filled with panic. The group scrambled to the car, slamming the doors shut as the woman's clawed hands scraped against the windows. The car's engine roared to life, tires squealing as they sped away from the cursed hospital. But as they drove, they couldn't shake the feeling that the entity, whatever it was still with them. Through the rearview mirror, they watched the hospital shrink into the distance. But then, in the reflection, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The same pale figure from the trunk, still in her hospital gown, was now standing at the side of the road, watching them drive away. Her face was expressionless, her eyes hollow, yet the twisted smile that slowly formed across her lips told them all they needed to know. She was no longer bound to the hospital. She was following them. The miles seemed to stretch endlessly, the tension building with every passing second. The whispers from their EVP recorder had stopped, but the air in the car felt suffocating, thick with the weight of unseen eyes. Each of them kept glancing nervously at the rearview mirror, waiting for anything to appear. Suddenly, the radio flickered to life, the static loud and aggressive, almost as if something was trying to communicate through it. It cut through the silence with a single chilling phrase: "You can run, but you can't escape." The car screeched to a halt as the headlights illuminated something ahead, another figure standing in the middle of the road. A man in a doctor's coat, his face obscured by shadows, but his stance rigid and menacing. Behind him, figures in tattered hospital gowns emerged from the darkness, all of them staring at the car with hollow, unblinking eyes. The group's hearts pounded as they scrambled for the doors, but before they could make a move, the figures began to move toward them. Slowly, relentlessly. "You shouldn't have come," the doctor's voice echoed in their minds, his words sharp and heavy. The headlights flickered, casting brief flashes of light onto the approaching figures, and in those fleeting moments, they saw the horror faces covered in blood, hands twisted into unnatural shapes, and eyes that were wide open, but lifeless. Just as they were about to open the doors and run, everything went black. The car's lights shut off. The radio died. The engine stalled. And in the silence, they heard the unmistakable sound of the car doors unlocking themselves. The last thing they saw before the darkness consumed them was the face of the doctor, standing at the front of the car, smiling in a way that was too knowing, too horrifying. His grin stretched impossibly wide. As the night swallowed them whole, the whispers returned, louder than ever. "You belong to us now." The world around them seemed to warp, bending and distorting as the darkness pressed in on all sides. The silence was suffocating, and the cold seeped deep into their bones. The once familiar interior of the car now felt alien, as though they had been transported to another place altogether. The oppressive air made it hard to breathe, each of them gasping for air, but the car's windows remained clouded, offering no relief from the growing sense of dread. Suddenly, the car jerked, as though something heavy had pressed against it from all sides. The lights flickered back on for an instant, and in the blink of an eye, they saw the doctor's face too close, too real, as though he was right in front of them, breathing down their necks. His lips moved, but the words were too distorted to make out. Before they could react, the temperature inside the car plummeted. Their breath became visible, and the windows began to fog up from the inside. A series of sharp, echoing knocks sounded against the car doors. Jack tried to start the engine, but it sputtered and died once more. Panic set in, and the group fumbled for their phones, but none of them would turn on. The signals were dead, the screens flickering with static. Then, the whispers returned, but this time, they were much louder, clearer. The voices came from all directions, filling the car and shaking their very souls. You can't run from your fate. It's too late. Sarah felt a sudden coldness on her shoulder, a pressure that was not her own. She turned to find a pale hand resting lightly on her, the fingers curling slightly as though beckoning her toward the door. Her heart skipped a beat as she recoiled, but the hand didn't move. It remained there, like a reminder of something that had been waiting for her. A chilling laugh erupted from the back of the car, high-pitched and unnatural. One of the figures from the road, the woman in the hospital gown, was now sitting in the back seat, her face mere inches from Sarah's. Her eyes, hollow and dark, seemed to stretch into endless voids, sucking in the light. "You'll never leave." The woman's lips barely moved, but the words cut through the silence like a blade. Her voice was deep, distorted, layered with the sounds of distant screams and tortured moans. The group pressed themselves into the car's seats, their bodies rigid with fear. The temperature continued to drop. Ice began to form on the edges of the windows, and frost spread across the dashboard. The woman's presence in the back seat felt suffocating, as if she had become part of the car, part of them. Her cold, lifeless fingers brushed against Sarah's neck, sending a wave of ice through her spine. In the front seat, Jack gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. "We need to get out of here," he shouted, his voice strained. But it was clear there was no escape. The doors wouldn't budge, the windows wouldn't roll down. They were trapped. A low, guttural growl suddenly rumbled from underneath the car, vibrating through the seats, shaking the entire vehicle. It sounded like the very ground beneath them was alive, angry. And then, from beneath the floorboards, something began to stir. There was a scraping sound, like claws dragging against metal, growing louder by the second. "What is that?" Sarah gasped, eyes wide with terror. She didn't want to know, but at the same time, she had to see, it had to understand the nightmare that was unfolding. The car shook again, this time more violently, and with it came a sharp, sudden bang from underneath, followed by a deafening screech. The headlights flashed one last time, illuminating the figure of the doctor no longer standing in front of the car, but now inside, his eyes glowing with a sickly light, his hands outstretched as if beckoning them toward him. He was no longer just a man, his form had distorted, as if consumed by the very place that haunted them. His face was elongated, twisted beyond recognition, and his mouth gaped open too wide, stretching beyond the limits of human anatomy. His eyes were black voids, dark and consuming. "You are mine," he rasped, his voice a chorus of broken whispers. "You'll never leave. You'll never escape." And then, with a violent lurch, the car was suddenly in motion. But it wasn't driving forward. It was being pulled, dragged. The group screamed, but no sound came. The car lurched down an unseen path, the tires squealing in protest as the asphalt beneath them gave way to a different world. The hospital, the road, the woods, it all disappeared. The surroundings seemed to warp and bend as if the car was being swallowed by a shifting, unnatural void. Sarah's hand shot out to grab the door handle, but the woman in the hospital gown reached out, grabbing her wrist with a strength that was impossible for someone so fragile. She pulled Sarah back into the seat, her fingers like ice. "No!" Sarah screamed, trying to break free, but the grip tightened. Through the warped and fogged windows, the figure of the doctor appeared again, his grotesque form growing closer, his smile widening in a way that shouldn't have been possible. His face was twisted, the skin stretched tight over his skull, the eyes empty black voids that seemed to pull her in, hypnotizing her. As they drove deeper into the shifting darkness, the air grew thinner, the temperature plummeted further. And then, in a moment of pure dread, the last sound they heard was a faint, distant wail, the sound of souls trapped forever within the walls of the Abandoned Villa Psychiatric Hospital. Then, nothing. The car screeched to a halt, but there was no ground beneath them, just a black, endless void. The figures of the tortured souls, including the pale woman and the twisted doctor, closed in around the vehicle, their hollow eyes staring into the hearts of the investigators. With no way to escape, the group felt themselves being pulled from the car, their bodies weightless, drawn toward the ever-encroaching darkness. The spirits of the abandoned hospital, their minds lost in torment and their souls chained to the place, enveloped the investigators, claiming them one by one. Their screams were swallowed by the void. In the days that followed, the car was found, abandoned at the side of the road, the doors wide open. But no trace of the investigators was ever discovered. The abandoned Villa Psychiatric Hospital remained as cursed and forgotten as before, waiting for the next unsuspecting souls to wander too close. And the whispers continued, rising from the ruins, forever repeating the same chilling words. You will never leave. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.